tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees.
Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
That morning, an innocent man was being judged, without real evidence, without a fair defense, and with a decision that, deep down, already seemed made. In front of him stood the man who had the power to decide his fate. But what happened in that trial was not just a legal process. It was one of the most unjust and most decisive moments in all of history, because if his innocence was evident, one question becomes unavoidable. Why was he condemned? To understand what truly happened before Pilate, we need to go back a few hours. Everything begins the night before. Jesus had already been betrayed, not by a distant enemy, but by someone close. His arrest was not random. It was planned, silent, executed at the exact moment. In Gethsemane, in the middle of the darkness, Jesus is captured without resistance. And from that moment on, everything accelerates. He is taken before religious leaders in a trial held during the night, something highly irregular. There is no pause, no balance, no real attempt to examine the truth. There is urgency, urgency to accuse, urgency to condemn, urgency to close the case. But there is a clear problem. The accusations don't hold. The testimonies don't match. And still, the process continues, because the goal is not to discover the truth. It is to justify a decision that has already been made. However, those authorities could not carry out the final sentence, and that changes everything. Jesus is taken before Roman power, before Pontius Pilate, the governor responsible for maintaining order, a man used to judging with authority. But this case is different. The accusations now shift. They become political. They are presented as a threat to the system. And even so, there is one key detail. Pilate finds no fault, and the tension rises. If there is no crime, why does the trial continue? Because what is happening there is not just a trial. It is a collision between truth, pressure, and power. And what is about to happen reveals something unsettling: how far a person can recognize the truth and still choose to ignore it. If you want to understand the most powerful moments of the Bible, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, if you had been there, facing that decision, would you have had the courage to stand for what you knew was right? Everything begins in a place that, at first glance, feels distant from conflict. Gethsemane, a garden set apart from the noise of the city, where Jesus had gone with his disciples not to hide, not to escape, but to pray. There is no crowd, no confrontation, no visible tension, only stillness, interrupted only by the weight of what is about to unfold. But that stillness does not last, because in the middle of the night, movement begins to emerge from the darkness. Lights appear in the distance. The sound of footsteps grows clearer. Voices, low at first, then more defined. A group approaches, not randomly, not uncertainly, but with direction, with purpose, with coordination. This is not a search. It is an operation. And at the front of that group stands someone who does not belong there as an outsider, but as someone who knows exactly where to go. Judas, the one who had walked alongside Jesus, who had heard his teachings, who had witnessed his actions up close, now becomes the one who leads others to him. And the signal he uses is not force. It is a gesture, a kiss, something normally associated with loyalty, with closeness, with trust, now becomes the mark of betrayal. And in that moment, everything shifts. Jesus does not step back. He does not resist. He does not attempt to avoid what is happening. He allows it. And that choice defines everything that follows. Because from that point on, the process that begins is not one driven by discovery, but by direction. He is taken away immediately, not to a public setting, not to a formal gathering, but into a sequence of events that unfolds quickly, almost urgently, as if time itself were being compressed to reach a conclusion as soon as possible. He is brought before religious authorities, but not during the day, not in a structured environment, not under conditions that would allow transparency or careful evaluation. The trial begins at night, and that detail is not minor, because according to established Jewish legal practice, trials were not meant to be conducted under those conditions. There were procedures, safeguards, expectations designed to ensure fairness and clarity. But here, those structures are set aside. Everything moves forward without pause, without balance, without the normal rhythm that would allow truth to be examined properly. And as the accusations begin, the instability of the process becomes even more visible. Witnesses are called, statements are presented, attempts are made to construct a case strong enough to justify a condemnation. But something continues to fail. The testimonies do not align. The narratives contradict each other. What is said by one cannot be confirmed by another, and instead of strengthening the case, each new statement weakens it. Under normal circumstances, this would halt the process. It would raise doubt. It would demand reconsideration. But that does not happen, because the objective here is not to test the accusations. It is to sustain them. The inconsistencies are not addressed. They are bypassed, ignored, set aside in favor of maintaining momentum. And as this continues, the role of the high priest becomes more prominent. The process shifts from gathering evidence to provoking a decisive statement. The goal is no longer to prove something externally, but to extract something directly from Jesus himself. And that moment arrives. Jesus speaks, not in self-defense as it would normally be expected, not in a way that attempts to dismantle the accusations one by one, but in a way that affirms his identity, something that, within that setting, carries enormous weight. And that affirmation is enough. Not because it resolves the inconsistencies of the case, not because it provides legal clarity, but because it confirms what those present had already determined internally. The reaction is immediate. Outrage, accusations of blasphemy, a declaration that no further evidence is needed. And just like that, the trial reaches its conclusion, not built on a coherent case, not supported by consistent testimony, but driven by a decision that had been forming long before the trial even began. And yet, there is still a limitation. Because even with that verdict, the authority of those leaders is incomplete. They can judge according to their law, they can declare guilt, but they cannot carry out the final sentence. And that forces the process into its next phase. Jesus must be taken elsewhere, to a different authority, one that operates under a different system, one that is not governed by religious law, but by political power. But before that transition happens, something else becomes evident. The atmosphere changes again. What had already been an irregular trial begins to take on a more hostile tone. Jesus is no longer just accused. He is mocked, struck, humiliated, not as part of a formal sentence, but as an expression of contempt. And this reveals something deeper about the moment, because the process is no longer simply unjust. It has become personal, emotional, driven not by a desire for truth, but by rejection. And in the middle of all of this, there is a contrast that cannot be ignored. Jesus does not react. He does not retaliate. He does not attempt to reclaim control through force or argument. He remains steady, and that stillness, instead of calming the situation, exposes it. Because when someone refuses to participate in the logic of conflict, it makes the imbalance even more visible. And that is exactly what happens. By the time the decision is finalized within that religious setting, one thing is already clear. The outcome was never truly in question. Only the process needed to catch up with it. And now, as Jesus is prepared to be taken before Roman authority, another shift becomes necessary. Because what was enough to condemn him in a religious context will not be enough in a political one. The accusations will have to change. The narrative will have to adapt. Because the next phase will not be about doctrine. It will be about power, about order, about the perception of threat. And that raises a crucial question that sets the stage for what comes next. If the verdict had already been decided, what would they do now to convince someone who did not see the same guilt? Because from this point forward, the trial does not simply continue, it transforms. And in that transformation, everything becomes even more complex. After a night marked by urgency, irregularity, and a process already moving toward a predetermined conclusion, Jesus is brought, at first light, into an entirely different environment, one where the rules shift, the language changes, and the purpose is no longer religious, but political. Now, the case enters Roman jurisdiction, and that changes everything. Because Pontius Pilate is not concerned with theological disputes or internal religious tensions, his responsibility is far more practical and immediate: to maintain order, to prevent unrest, and to ensure that nothing threatens the stability of Roman authority. When Jesus is presented before him, he is not introduced as a teacher or a spiritual leader, but as a potential threat. And that threat must be defined, which is why, at this moment, the accusations begin to shift. What was previously framed in religious terms is now reformulated into political language. It is no longer about blasphemy or doctrine, but about power, influence, and the possibility of rebellion. They claim that Jesus calls himself a king, that he challenges Caesar, that his influence over the people could disrupt the order Rome is determined to preserve. It is a strategic transformation, because what could not justify a sentence under Roman law must now be presented in a way that appears dangerous within that system. Pilate listens, he observes, and then, instead of reacting emotionally or relying solely on what he has been told, he does something that immediately shifts the tone of the encounter. He questions Jesus directly. "Are you the king of the Jews?" It is a precise question, not vague, not symbolic, but focused on the core of the accusation. Because if Jesus truly presents himself as a political king, and then this is no longer a minor issue, it becomes a matter of imperial concern. But the answer he gives does not fit into Pilate's expectations. It is not evasive, but neither is it aligned with the kind of threat Pilate is accustomed to dealing with. There is no ambition for power, no call to rebellion, no attempt to mobilize or provoke, and that creates an immediate tension, because Pilate, who has likely encountered many who sought influence through force or manipulation, finds nothing in Jesus that matches that pattern. There is no urgency in his posture, no aggression in his tone, no indication of someone seeking to destabilize authority, and that detail becomes critical. For the first time in the entire process, someone with actual power sees no fault. The momentum of the trial slows. The certainty that drove the previous stage begins to fracture. Pilate recognizes that something is not aligning, that the accusations being presented do not correspond with the person standing before him, and this places him in a difficult position. Because on one side, there are leaders pressing the case forward, intensifying their claims, insisting that action must be taken. And on the other, there is a man who, by all visible measures, does not represent the threat he has been accused of being. That contradiction cannot be ignored. So Pilate makes a statement, clear, direct. He finds no guilt in Jesus, and under normal circumstances, that would be the end of the matter. The case would be dismissed. The accused would be released. But that is not what happens. Because what is unfolding here is no longer controlled solely by judicial reasoning. It is being driven by external pressure. The voices do not quiet. They do not retreat. Instead, they intensify. The accusations grow broader, more insistent, more urgent. They claim that Jesus is stirring the people, that his influence extends beyond one region, that his presence represents an ongoing risk, and gradually, the environment begins to shift. What started as an interrogation becomes a situation charged with collective pressure. Pilate is no longer just evaluating evidence. He is managing tension. He is navigating the possibility of unrest. And this is where politics begins to outweigh procedure. Because even in the absence of clear guilt, the potential for disorder becomes a factor. And that introduces a deeper question into the scene. If the accused is innocent, but the pressure continues to rise, what matters more to a ruler, justice or stability? And it is precisely at this moment that Pilate begins to look for a way out. Not a solution grounded purely in truth, but an alternative that allows him to avoid making a direct decision that could escalate the situation. Because he understands something now. This is not a simple case. This is not a routine judgment. Whatever decision is made here will carry consequences. And so, instead of concluding the matter, he searches for another path, another option, another way to redirect responsibility, or at least delay the outcome. But what he is about to discover is this: when pressure is no longer seeking truth, but demanding a result, even the clearest recognition of innocence may not be enough to stop what is coming. What had, until that moment, remained within the structure of a controlled judicial process begins to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, into something far less stable, far more volatile, and significantly more dangerous, because the pressure no longer comes only from the leaders. Now, it begins to spread. The crowd enters the scene, not as passive observers standing at a distance, but as an active force, influenced, directed, and gradually intensified by those who had already determined the outcome they wanted to see. The religious leaders do not step back. They press forward. They repeat the accusations, not necessarily strengthening them with new evidence, but amplifying them with urgency, with insistence, with emotional weight. And that shift is critical, because when arguments fail to convince, volume begins to replace substance, repetition begins to replace clarity, and influence begins to outweigh truth. The voices multiply. What were once statements become shouts. What began as accusations becomes demand, and the atmosphere changes completely. This is no longer a courtroom in the traditional sense. It is becoming a space shaped by collective pressure, and Pilate sees it. He recognizes that what stands before him is no longer just a case to be judged, but a crowd that is beginning to move as one, driven not by careful evaluation, but by growing emotion. And that kind of environment is unstable, because once a crowd reaches a certain intensity, it stops responding to reason and begins responding to momentum. The voices grow louder, the insistence becomes sharper, the tension becomes visible, almost tangible, and in the middle of it all, Jesus remains silent. He does not respond in the way that might calm the situation. He does not defend himself with arguments that could dismantle the accusations publicly. He does not attempt to reshape the perception that is forming around him. And that silence does something unexpected. It does not reduce the tension, it magnifies it. Because when there is no counter-argument, the noise fills the space. And that noise, in this moment, is not neutral. It is charged with pressure. Pilate attempts to maintain control. He tries to hold on to a rational position within an environment that is becoming increasingly irrational. But each attempt meets resistance, because the crowd is no longer evaluating. It is demanding. And that transition changes everything. Because the moment a trial stops being a search for truth and becomes a response to pressure, justice begins to lose its place. Pilate knows this. He knows there is no clear guilt. He knows the accusations lack consistency. But he also knows something else. He knows the situation is escalating. He knows the crowd is gaining momentum. He knows that a decision that goes against that momentum could trigger something larger. And that realization introduces a new dimension to the conflict. Because now the tension is no longer only external. It becomes internal. Pilate is no longer simply weighing evidence. He is calculating risk, measuring consequences, balancing two forces that, in this moment, stand in direct opposition: truth and pressure. And as the crowd grows louder, as the demands become more unified, as the intensity continues to rise, the space for a decision based purely on justice becomes smaller, until it begins to disappear. And that is the turning point, because at that moment, control over the outcome is no longer held entirely by the judge. It is shared with the crowd. And once that happens, the nature of the decision changes. It is no longer shaped only by what is right, but by what is being demanded. And that makes the outcome begin to feel inevitable. And yet Pilate is not ready to surrender. Not completely. He still looks for a way out, a strategy, an alternative that might allow him to resolve the situation without directly yielding to the pressure. And it is exactly at this point that an idea begins to form, a possibility that, on the surface, seems capable of restoring balance. But what he does not fully realize yet is that the crowd is no longer looking for balance. It is looking for a result, and any attempt to redirect that momentum will only delay what is coming next, because what follows will not reduce the tension. It will push it even further. At this point in the trial, where the pressure has already reached a level that can no longer be ignored, and where every passing moment seems to increase the risk of escalation, Pilate finds himself in a position that is both politically sensitive and personally uncomfortable. Because although he has already concluded that there is no real basis for condemning Jesus, he is now surrounded by a crowd whose demands are growing louder, more unified, and increasingly difficult to resist. And it is precisely within that tension that he begins to search for an alternative. Not a direct solution based on justice alone, but a strategy that allows him to avoid making a decision that could provoke further instability. The first opportunity appears almost naturally. Pilate realizes that Jesus is from Galilee, which places him under the jurisdiction of Herod, who happens to be in Jerusalem at that time, and in that moment, what might seem like a simple administrative detail becomes a potential escape route, a way to transfer responsibility, to shift the burden of judgment onto someone else, and perhaps in doing so, remove himself from the center of a situation that is becoming increasingly difficult to control. So he sends Jesus to Herod, and for a brief moment, there is a possibility that the decision will be taken out of his hands. But that possibility does not last, because Jesus is returned. No sentence, no resolution, no closure. Only the same unresolved tension, now intensified by the failure of that first attempt. And with that, Pilate is brought back to the same position, but with less room to maneuver than before. The pressure has not decreased, it has grown. The crowd has not calmed, it has become more expectant. And now, any further delay begins to carry its own risk, which leads Pilate to consider a second option, one that, at least on the surface, appears more promising. There was a custom. During the Passover, it was common for the governor to release a prisoner as a gesture toward the people, an act that, while symbolic, carried enough weight to influence public perception and, in moments like this, potentially diffuse tension. And Pilate sees in that custom an opportunity, a way to place the decision not entirely in his own hands, but in the hands of the crowd, a way to create a choice. But this choice is not neutral, because the contrast is deliberate. On one side, Jesus. On the other, Barabbas, a man whose reputation is already known, not as a misunderstood figure, not as someone surrounded by uncertainty, but as someone clearly associated with violence, rebellion, and actions that directly challenged the order Rome was determined to maintain. And that contrast matters, because logically the outcome should be obvious. If the crowd is given a choice between someone who is widely recognized as guilty and someone in whom no fault has been found, the expectation is clear. Justice should prevail. The innocent should be released. And for a moment, it seems as though this strategy might work. Pilate presents the option. He frames the decision. He creates the conditions for what should be a straightforward outcome. And then, he waits. But what follows does not align with expectation, because by this point, the crowd is no longer acting independently. It has already been influenced, shaped, directed. The voices that rise are not spontaneous. They are aligned, focused, unified around a result that has been building since before the trial even began. And then the name is spoken. Barabbas. At first it emerges from parts of the crowd. But quickly, it spreads, grows louder, more insistent, more forceful, until it becomes a single, overwhelming response. Barabbas, repeated, again and again, each time stronger than the last. And in that moment, everything shifts, because the option that was meant to create resolution creates a deeper conflict. The strategy that was meant to open a path toward justice reveals how far the situation has already moved away from it. The crowd has chosen, and it has chosen against evidence, against logic, against fairness. And that places Pilate in an even more difficult position than before. Because now, this is no longer just about pressure. It is about a public decision, a decision he himself invited, expecting a different result. And yet, even at this point, he does not immediately concede. He asks one more question, a question that, in theory, should bring the situation back into focus. Then what shall I do with Jesus? It is an attempt to reintroduce reason, to create a moment of pause, to reopen the possibility of a different outcome. But the response comes quickly, and it is stronger, because now the demand is no longer about choosing between two men. It is about delivering a sentence, a final one, an irreversible one. Crucify him, and the repetition begins, not as isolated voices, but as a unified demand that grows with each second. The intensity increases, the space for hesitation disappears, and what was once a possibility of release transforms into a direct path toward condemnation. What began as an attempt to save Jesus becomes the mechanism that brings him closer to the cross. And that reveals something critical about this moment. When collective pressure overtakes truth, even well-intended decisions can lead to the exact opposite of what was intended. And Pilate begins to see it. He begins to understand that the situation is no longer within his control in the way he had hoped. But by the time that realization fully settles in, the momentum has already moved beyond recovery, because what comes next will not be another attempt. It will be a decision, and one that cannot be undone. At this stage of the trial, what is unfolding can no longer be interpreted as a complex decision within a difficult legal situation, nor as a moment of uncertainty that requires careful evaluation. What is happening is a complete distortion of justice, where truth has lost its ability to sustain itself against the force of collective pressure. The crowd has already made its choice, and that choice is unmistakable. Barabbas, a man whose identity is not surrounded by ambiguity, whose actions are not debated or uncertain, but clearly associated with violence, with rebellion, with disruption, the very kind of individual that Roman authority was meant to suppress, control, and ultimately punish. And yet, his name rises above all others, not quietly, not hesitantly, but with strength, with insistence, with a unity that reveals something deeper than mere preference, because this is not a decision formed through reflection. It is a decision shaped by influence. And that distinction is critical, because when a crowd begins to move under influence rather than evidence, and the outcome is no longer guided by truth, but by the strength of the narrative that dominates the moment. And in this case, that narrative has already taken hold. Pilate sees it. He understands that what stands before him is not simply a group of individuals expressing independent judgment, but a collective force that has been directed, molded, and aligned toward a specific outcome. And that realization makes the situation even more difficult, because now, the issue is no longer just about choosing between two men. It is about confronting the fact that justice itself has been displaced, that the process has moved beyond fairness, that the result is being driven not by what is right, but by what is being demanded. And still, the moment does not end with the release of Barabbas, because once that decision is made, another question emerges, one that is even more critical. What should be done with Jesus? And this question, which should reopen the possibility of a just resolution, instead intensifies the situation even further, because the crowd does not hesitate, it does not reconsider, it does not pause, it demands. And what it demands is not moderate, it is not negotiable, it is final. Crucify him. The words do not appear once, they repeat, they echo, they grow stronger with each repetition until they form a single, unified voice that dominates the entire scene. And with each shout, the space for any alternative begins to disappear, because this is no longer a suggestion, it is an insistence, a demand that carries weight not through logic, but through sheer intensity. And in that moment, the injustice becomes fully visible. It is no longer hidden behind weak arguments or inconsistent testimonies. It is no longer masked by procedural irregularities. It is exposed, clear, direct. A crowd calling for the execution of a man whom the judge himself has already declared innocent. And that is the most critical point of the entire trial, because it reveals the true conflict at the heart of the story, not between two interpretations of facts, but between what is right and what is convenient. Pilate knows what is right. He has said it. He has repeated it. He finds no fault. But what he now faces is no longer a simple legal decision. It is a situation charged with pressure, with risk, with the possibility of escalation. A situation that threatens to move beyond control if handled incorrectly. And that introduces a powerful factor into the equation. Fear. Not immediate fear, but calculated fear. The fear of losing order, the fear of triggering unrest, the fear of consequences that extend beyond this single moment. And when that kind of fear enters the decision-making process, justice begins to lose ground, because maintaining stability starts to feel more urgent than defending truth. And that is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable reality. Because at this point, the issue is no longer ignorance of the truth. It is the recognition of it, combined with the refusal to act on it. And that distinction changes everything, because it means the final decision will not be made in confusion. It will be made in clarity, not because the right path is unclear, but because the cost of choosing it feels too high, and that prepares the ground for what comes next. A decision that will define the entire moment. A decision not born from doubt, but from pressure. A decision that will be remembered not only for what was done, but for what was knowingly allowed. At this moment, everything converges. All the pressure that has been building, all the voices that have been rising, all the tension that has been growing without interruption, now reaches a point where no further delay is possible. The crowd is no longer asking. It is no longer arguing. It is demanding. And it does so with a force that leaves no room for hesitation, no space for careful reasoning, no opportunity for a decision made in calm. Pilate stands at the center of it all. He knows the facts. He has heard the accusations. He has questioned Jesus personally, and he has already reached a clear conclusion. There is no guilt, no solid evidence, no justification for what the crowd is demanding. And yet, the situation does not resolve, because what he is facing is no longer a legal dilemma. It is a political one, a moment where the right decision stands in direct conflict with the convenient one. The voices continue. Crucify him, again and again, louder each time, more unified, more forceful, until the demand itself begins to shape the outcome. Pilate attempts, one last time, to hold on to reason. He raises the question. He looks for a justification, for anything that could support what is being asked. But nothing appears, and nothing is offered, because the crowd is no longer responding with arguments. It is responding with pressure, and that changes everything, because now, even silence becomes dangerous. Every moment without a decision allows the tension to grow, allows the risk to increase, allows the possibility of disorder to come closer. And it is in that moment that Pilate performs one of the most symbolic acts of the entire narrative. He takes water, and he washes his hands, not as a practical gesture, but as a declaration, a statement that he does not accept responsibility for what is about to happen. But that gesture, as powerful as it may seem, does not change reality, because the decision is not avoided. It is made. Pilate yields, not because he is convinced, not because new evidence has emerged, but because the pressure has become stronger than his willingness to resist it. And in that instant, everything is defined. The judge who knew that Jesus was innocent delivers him to be crucified, not in confusion, not in uncertainty, but in clarity, overridden by pressure. Jesus is handed over. The sentence is carried out, and what unfolds is not the result of a discovery, but the result of a surrender. And that is what makes this moment so powerful, because justice did not fail due to lack of truth. It failed despite it. And that reality echoes far beyond that morning, because it reveals something that continues to exist even now, that a person can recognize what is right and still choose otherwise. What happened in that trial was not just a sequence of human decisions shaped by pressure, fear, and political interest. It was also the unfolding of something far greater, something that had already been spoken, something that went beyond the limits of that courtroom. Because even though human justice failed, the purpose did not. The sentence was not the end. It was the path, a path that, from a human perspective, looked like injustice, like defeat, like a moment where truth had been silenced. But in reality, it was leading toward the fulfillment of something much greater within the plan of God. And that changes everything. Because what seemed like loss was not the final outcome. But even so, that scene leaves a question that still speaks today. How many times is truth ignored? Not because it is unclear, but because it is easier to give in to pressure. How many decisions even now are made not based on what is right, but on what feels safer, more convenient, more acceptable in the moment? That trial did not stay in the past. It still speaks. It still confronts. It still reveals what happens when truth loses ground to fear. If this message made you reflect, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep exploring the most powerful moments of the Bible. And tell me in the comments, Do you think you would have had the courage to choose differently in that moment? Because that trial ended, but its consequences are still echoing today.